When people argue that defending oneself from harm is not authoritarian, many might like to respond that this argument is the same one which the state uses in its justifications for using force against its citizens, that it is acting in self-defense. Therefore, assault and reactions to said assault both comprise the same authoritarian action. The following is a thread on this very topic by the essayist Buchanan. Her writing here is altogether elegant, relatable, and damning, prose that I could only dream about being able to emulate. So I figured I wouldn't bother, and just let her words speak for themselves. Proposal. Engaging in self-defense is itself authoritarian. Supporting argument. The bourgeois state only targets people in its own self-defense, therefore self-defense is an authoritarian act. Conclusion. The anarchistic critique of authoritarianism is nonsensical because their own means of resistance are also authoritarian. That we've clarified what this claim is on the surface, we can break it down further. First, we need to investigate what authoritarianism actually means. So, within the bounds of this claim, authoritarianism is any act of force or imposition of one's will, whether that be another person or an entire system. Of course, with this definition, we run into an endless host of other issues. Authoritarianism, as defined by this claim, covers a massive range of social interactions. In this definition, if someone comes up and grabs me, and I forcefully pull away, I am engaging in an act of authoritarianism. The distinctions between me and my assailant disappear. Rather than them being an aggressor on my bodily autonomy, and me defending that bodily autonomy, we are both equal opponents in a conflict trying to assert our authority, and my autonomy becomes the spoils. Might makes right. So there are two fundamental issues with this definition of authority. Firstly, it expands the definition of authority to the extent that its function as a term is destroyed. And secondly, it reduces all human social interactions to a series of equivalent struggles for power and domination. In this definition, liberation itself becomes distorted from an articulation of freedom and autonomy to an articulation of who gets to have the ability to dominate others. Acts of rebellion against domination for the sake only of freedom from domination do not exist here. It is a similar dynamic of when men accuse women of being sexist for pointing out their misogyny. It's a means of flattening out the structural systems of domination into a two-way interpersonal conflict. If I accept the terms that men put forth when they accuse me of being sexist for challenging patriarchy, what I am ultimately accepting is that there is no structural power imbalances between us, and I concede to the destruction of the political analysis of patriarchy. Returning to our earlier example of somebody grabbing me, in the claim that my reassertion of my own bodily autonomy is an act of authoritarianism is the underlying assumption that my bodily autonomy can be reduced to spoils in an equal conflict. What vanishes is the moral judgment that the person grabbing me without my consent is taking hold of something that is not, and never could be, theirs to claim. It denies that my act of self-defense is an assertion of that moral value, not an equal assertion of domination. Moving back out to the macro-political view, the assertion in this claim denies the fundamental dynamic that is always at play in state power. The state is a means for a group of people to lay claim to something that is not, and never can be, theirs, our bodily and political autonomy. This brings us to the next part of this claim. The bourgeois state only targets people in its own self-defense. Therefore, self-defense is an authoritarian act. The state certainly is defending something, but the question we need to be asking is what? When we engage in self-defense against the state, we are attempting to pull ourselves from the person who grabbed us. We are asserting our own personal autonomy. When the state defends itself against us, then it is defending its ability to have control over our autonomy. The state's defense is on par with the person who grabbed me, who, when I attempted to get free, held me tighter and struck me. That is not what an equal struggle for power looks like. It is an act of domination and assertion of sovereignty. That is not self-defense. To accept the state enforcing its sovereignty as an act of self-defense does two things here. First, it makes a complex social structure into a self, with rights that should be respected. And second, it accepts that people, regardless of their consent, are natural possessions of that self. It would do us well then to investigate why there has been such a long tradition of people expanding authoritarianism into meaninglessness. What is the point? What is the intended outcome? The point, in light of what we explored here, is that when they can get people to concede that acts of resistance are acts of authoritarianism, it is simple then to bypass an analysis of power and how hierarchy functions, and to make people feel that a state project is their only option. Complex dynamics of power and domination get flattened and simplified into what is essentially opposing sports teams fighting over who gets to claim the masses of people as their rightful possessions, and who will be allowed to enforce their sovereignty and demand our submission. What happens when people see politics this way, rather than a web of social relations that are determined and shaped by us collectively, is that they feel that their own political autonomy will always be up for grabs, and that they just need to choose the better master to fight for. Of course, many might seek to become the master themselves. In that case, seeing authoritarianism in this way serves another function, naturalizing their desire for power over others. Because everything is authority, so it's justified, or at least inevitable. We have to ask then, what function do we actually want authoritarianism to serve? What is our point in speaking about it? Why does it feel so important to not let this definition be expanded into meaninglessness? Well, like with terms such as patriarchy, and settler colonialism, and white supremacy, and capitalism, the point is to speak to a dynamic of power that is at work in our world and shapes our social conditions and our struggle to make those conditions liberatory. Authoritarianism allows us to speak about and challenge forms of social organization in which groups of people expand their own political power by undermining the political agency and autonomy of others by the use of force. It is a tool in the overall analysis of power. Importantly, it allows us to offer pointed critiques at the very projects whose advocates seek to obliterate the definition of authoritarianism in order to obfuscate their goals to assert their own sovereignty. Which should tell you why this discourse has continued for so long.